Okay, so Ramsey's history was not enough. It was too broad, um, too many different things going on there, and definitely too long to be a history that united everyone together. So Mercy Otis Warren, being a female, she could not directly participate in politics, but Warren believed that she could give a civil service to the country through writing a unique American history. So she wrote the history of the rise, progress, and termination of the American Revolution, which was published in 1805. It was a narrative of a nationhood, and it was a dramatical history. And what I mean by that was it was driven by love of liberty and virtue. And what it did was it opposed an ungrateful, dissipated, and corrupt British nation. So she kind of looked at two things. One, they were joined together in this disdain that they had for the British. And the second was she joined them together and that they did have a unique history of joining together in the Revolutionary War. So that war being really what gave all the colonies or former colonies a shared history toward this new culture. So during the war, social order and hierarchies were completely disrupted. And you can see that in this letter that John Adams wrote to Abigail Adams. I would encourage you to pause the video for just a moment and read what he wrote. But he does talk about that college students, really everything just flips with the hierarchy. So college students planted liberty trees, they joined militias, they pushed parents and professors into a radical political positions. Apprentices were released to fight. Servants fought with their masters instead of against their masters. Some slaves found freedom on one side or the other. So whether they found freedom through the British or through the Americans, some of them did find that freedom. Some women managed households, families, farms, and businesses while their husbands were absent. And, we talked about the camp followers last week, and a lot of women did follow their husbands because they would have had financial ruin if they hadn't. And Martha Washington did at times kind of go out, but for the most part, women like Martha Washington and Abigail Adams were left to run everything at home while their husbands were away. And so we have this tremendous amount of primary source documentation between John Adams and Abigail Adams, and he speaks to Abigail for the most part very openly. Abigail Adams, there's letters from her very early in this saying, don't forget the women as this new nation is being set up. And we know that in many ways, in many facets, women were forgotten. But, everything just kind of flip-flops around. Things at home don't always pause whenever there's a war going on. So the women often found themselves in those positions of running things. So when the Sons of Liberty were protesting, slaves also saw this irony in the wording that the colonists were using against the British and where they're calling for liberty. So what we find is one of the ways in which they did define a unique culture was through this concept of otherness. Now, otherness is defining ourselves by what we are not. You can see the four apples there. You have, the one red apple, it's not the yellow apples. So it's kind of defining yourself in opposites. You can look at this and say, okay, well, I don't have blonde hair, I don't have blue eyes. Maybe I'm not tall, those kind of things. And we still do this on a daily basis, whether you realize it or not. Otherness is and was a central part of creating an American culture. So the things that they began looking at is, okay, we're not British citizens. We're not slaves. We're not Native Americans. So Americans found it increasingly important, especially in that middle class, to move away from courtly qualities. And what I mean by courtly qualities is if you look at the English court, okay, English court has a very um, defined way of doing things. The queen often we tend to think that the queen or that the king will wear red. They don't. They wear purple because purple is such an expensive dye. Red was used for that group of court that was just below the king and the queen, and everyone had their own certain colors, kind of even that they wore to court. But the new Americans thought that things should be a little bit different. And they wanted to tie those notions to republicanism. So when you went to a gathering with the president of the United States, they wanted it to be more Republican than this royal court system. So, defining a social elite culture was something that George Washington basically had the very first responsibility of doing. Um, you watched a video last week of the different things that George Washington did, but this is one of the things that he does that is very important to defining the American culture. George Washington very much operated in a public sphere. He was declared president by a unanimous vote of the Electoral College. We have this idea that each individual vote elects the president of the United States. That's not how that happens. It's done so by the Electoral College. And so basically, if you set Maine and Nebraska aside, each state has electoral votes based on the population of the state. So, for example, in 1788, Connecticut had 14 electoral votes. To become the president, you have to have 50% of the Electoral College plus one. So Washington carried 7 of Connecticut's 14 votes. In total, Washington actually received 69 electoral votes. And this idea of the Electoral College is embodied in the Republican ideal. And so there very much was a public spirited leadership that dramatically, and so when Washington wins this, he does this dramatic surrendering of his sword to the Continental Congress at the end of the war. And it symbolized the subservientness of the military to the law. So Washington really kind of set out this immediate thing that the military was not going to be a higher power than the law of the United States. If you look at it, a lot of times when there's a revolution that happens in a country, it goes under military power because that military has kind of rised up against the government. And George Washington wanted to make this very clear that he was not going to rise up against that government, and he surrendered his sword. Washington was, he kind of had all kinds of things set in front of him. One of the things is, what do we call him? We can't set him up as king, even though he was offered it. Some of the things that were tossed around was His Highness, the President of the United States of America, and the protector of their liberties. Another one was His Majesty, the President. Washington's personal favorite was His High Mightiness. Another was President of the United States of America. All those are really pretty formal. So what they decided on was Mr. President. And if you think about it, it is still that way today. If you address the President of the United States, it is Mr. President. Washington was very virtuous. He took pains to elevate the public good over private interests and projected honesty and honor over ambition. Personally, Washington appeared very aloof, very dignified, but he did somewhat encourage those pomp and circumstance. So if you look at this picture, I mean, you can see this is actually an image of his carriage that would have been pulled by the horses. And even though they're trying to move away from this royal court idea with the British, it's kind of hard when that's all you know. So even though you do try to do some things different, like surrendering your sword and calling yourself Mr. Washington, some of those things are going to creep in, and we do see that somewhat. Like his cabinet He also had uniformed servants. They held weekly levees, which were hour-long audiences granted to distinguished visitors, which now in this case it did include women. And at these levees, you'd see uniformed servants attired in black velvet. And Washington himself would wear black velvet to these with a feathered hat and a polished sword. Martha Washington also has a very important part of this. I'm sorry, I got behind on my thing here. So there's his high and mightiness. This is Washington's first cabinet, which was Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Edmund Randolph. And to the levees. Martha Washington, though, she had to invent the role for the president's wife. Even England, if you look at England, there's definitely a role for the Queen, and she really did have a persona, though, that tended to go a little more on the queenly side, although there were ways in which it varied. She had to command respect without a crown. So she was an innovator. She was very dignified. And she often served as this lightning rod for criticism for her husband and cultural anxieties about aristocratic impulse. When she entertained, she did so somewhat differently. However, it was in a private sphere. She held her own levees on Friday nights, and she started this on May 29th of 1789. And these events were mixed male and female. There were many ladies present, and there were elements of ceremony in her levees. And it was there was somewhat a spirit of informality and entertainment. George Washington appeared as a private citizen at these, so he walked the room and he talked to people in that room. He came in without a sword, which signaled that he was not the host of these. And the visitors that came to these events were local elites of the capital. And keep in mind, the capital at this time is not Washington, D.C. You're looking at a capital that moves periodically, so New York and Philadelphia. But they had very distinguished visitors. Oftentimes foreigners came to these events. But it was held in the dining room, and one thing that Martha did that was very different from the Queen of England was she dressed in simple white. White, if you look at it in Europe, signifies a very low class because it doesn't require any dye to make that clothing. One of the things she did do, though, was she seated herself on a slightly raised platform. It wasn't a throne, but it still signaled that she was high-ranking. Other official wives would arrange themselves in a hierarchical arrangement around her. And then mirroring the group would be George and his cabinet around him. The servants announced each lady as they walked in, and a gentleman, and then received her at the door of the drawing room. And each lady was handed up to Martha. And then she would make a kind of curtsy and then was seated without noticing the rest of the company. George then approached the lady and spoke with her. But the things that she served at these were as the types of refreshments were like tea and coffee and lemonade and a very plain cake. So that there were some elements that were significantly different from what we see in England. So we'll look at some other ways that they tried to create a new American culture in the next couple videos.